This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Welcome to another episode of the Hindus in Focus podcast. I'm Zubeda Hamid, your host for today. The case of probationary IAS officer Puja Khedkar has exploded in the news recently. While a lot has been said and written with regard to Ms. Khedkar's alleged demand for privileges and her use of a siren on her private car made headlines, what has also come under the scanner is the disability quota in the All India services. Ms. Khedkar has been accused of falsely claiming to have disability to use the quota. This was followed by India's G20 Sherpa Amitabh Kant calling for a review of the reservations for persons with disabilities, as he claimed that these were being misused. And then Telangana IAS officer Smita Sabharwal questioned the need for this quota in the first place. Even as this continues to rage on social media platforms, what is not making the news quite as much is that there are candidates with disabilities who have qualified in the civil services exams but are yet to be placed. So, why is the disability quota and this quota alone being targeted? What do the rules say with regard to this reservation? What is the certification process like, and does this need changes or are there loopholes that need to be plugged? And why do there continue to be barriers for persons with disabilities who qualify in the exams? We dive into these questions and more with Rahul Bajaj, co founder at Mission Accessibility and a practicing lawyer. Welcome to the Hindus in Focus podcast, Mr. Bajaj.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I must tell you, I'm a listener of In Focus. So I'm particularly delighted to be on the other side, as it were.
That is such a nice thing to hear. Thank you. Mr. Bajaj, let's start off by if you could explain to us the rules for the disability quota in the UPSC.
Sure. So let me take a step back. Under the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, Section 34, it provides for a 4% reservation for persons with benchmark disabilities. A benchmark disability is a disability where the percentage is more than 40%. So there is a severity threshold attached to that. Now, what Section 34 says is that for 5 classes of disabilities which it recognizes therein, reservation is to be provided in the posts that are identified. Now, these disabilities are blindness, hearing impairment, locomotor disability, some intellectual disabilities such as autism are in the 4th category, and the 5th category is multiple disabilities such as deaf blindness. And cumulatively 4% posts are reserved in posts that are identified by the government. So the government has actually put out a list of about 3,000 odd posts that have been identified as being suitable for persons with disabilities. Now, all services, including the civil services, have to then reserve 4% seats. In the context of the UPSC, the way it works is that when you apply for the civil services examination, you have to indicate your disability type and what service you are applying for. And then if you are and there is a 4% reservation in some services. Some, for example, the IPS do not have any reservation at all, which is a different matter altogether. But in other services like IAS, IRS, etc., reservation is provided. And once you are selected, then you undergo a medical evaluation, which the UPSC has of its own, quite over and above the disability certificate that a disabled person might otherwise already have. And then after all of that is completed, they are selected. So the long and short of it is that they have a 4% reservation. But to get it, you have to also be able to clear their medical examination, which has to then indicate that your disability percentage and type is what you claim it is.
Got it. That's very clear. So, coming specifically to this Puja Khedkar case, how persons with disabilities for several years have now been saying that the certification system in itself is unwieldy and long-winded. How does this play out in general? We know that the state gives you a separate disability certificate, then there's a national ID thing, plus the railways has its own system. So, how does this all play out?
Right. So there are a couple of facets to your question. The first is issues connected with the disability. The first is the process for getting a disability certificate, and the second is issues connected with that, whether it be the issue you mentioned or others. So let me address those in turn. The first one is in terms of the process. Now, you need to apply online. There is a Swalambhan website which the government runs where you can apply for a disability certificate / UDID. The UDID is Unique Disability Identity Card, which is sort of the equivalent of an Aadhaar for persons with disabilities. It's supposed to be a one-stop shop kind of identity card for persons with disabilities for all purposes for which they need to have such a document. It is not that, but that I will get to in a bit. So once you apply, then you are evaluated by a medical board in a hospital which is authorized to evaluate your disability. There are government guidelines for assessment of certified of disabilities of given the given benchmark disabilities, which were updated earlier this year in March. And for each disability, there are different percentage points. So, for example, if you have a locomotor disability, if you have a missing finger, that will amount to 15% disability. If you are blind and if you can't read the eye chart, that will amount to a certain percentage. So, depending upon the nature and severity, different percentages are prescribed for each. And the next thing to note is that once that assessment happens, then on the basis of that, you are also issued a unique disability ID, as I mentioned. Now, that's the general process. It's supposed to get over within 30 days as per guidelines which the government has issued in even the draft national disability policy, I believe, mentions that. As a factual matter, though, the process takes much longer than that. Very often, it also happens that doctors or medical officers who are needed to evaluate a particular disability are not available. And in particular, we see this with psychosocial disabilities, and due to that, also the process keeps getting delayed. Like I had this one candidate with a locomotor disability, and there was no person from an orthopedic background who was available. So he kept on getting called again and again for his reassessment. Now, in terms of your second question about the multiplicity of disability identity documents, the problem there is that while this central disability certificate, and let me just correct you on one point, actually, it's not a state level thing. Disability certificate is a central level document, and the act actually says that whenever it is issued, it is supposed to be applicable across the country. But what ends up happening, as you have rightly pointed out, is that different authorities ask for a different certification, and the UPSC does the same. When I told you earlier that it requires you to undergo a medical examination after you clear the preliminary exam. I believe that is between the mains and the interview. I could be wrong about that, but that's my best understanding as to when that exam happens. So it may well be the case, and this happened with a client of mine whose disability certificate says that he has multiple disability, but the examination may only find him to have a locomotor disability, because also bear in mind that this is a very subjective exercise. Like the percentage determination of disability is not an exact science. In fact, I don't know of any other country which evaluates disability based on percentages this way. So very often you end up having conflicting findings, which determine what entitlements people can and cannot get. Similarly, with the railways, and the Delhi High Court has upheld this also, unfortunately. I was party to that litigation where the Delhi High Court upheld this requirement where the railways requires you to undergo a fresh certification process to get the concessions which they give you for traveling by train as a person with a disability. So there are issues at multiple levels which exist in the certification process.
So, do you think this system needs an overhaul? As you said, you don't know of any other country that uses this subjective percentage classification.
Right. So I'm generally someone who's in favor of incremental reform rather than completely dismantling what already exists. And I don't even think that that kind of overhaul is going to happen anytime soon. So a few things which I do think can happen in the interim is, one, we should focus on the functional limitations imposed by a particular disability more. and not just on the medical situation of the person. Because now we say that we are moving away from the medical model of disability to a social slash human rights model, where the focus has to be on how the person's limitations interact with the environment, and that results in the causation of barriers. So when that is what we are talking about, this percentage based system of 10% this finger being missing, 5% this limb being misshapen, it seems quite a medicalized way to approach things. So even if we want to continue with the percentage system because the act has it, I am not seeing any move to get the act amended anytime soon. So I guess within that, if we can try to have a more focus on functional limitations, that would be good. That's one point. The second is certification of invisible disabilities. For example, I am told that when it comes to autism, adults with autism have no mechanism of getting evaluated on their disability, because the metrics that are used to conduct this evaluation simply don't exist. Another example I'll give you, I'm involved in this matter which is going on in the Delhi High Court right now, where this individual who has a number of invisible disabilities like bipolar disorder, anxiety, etc., which are quite limiting for him, he has been turned away by the hospitals that he has gone to on the ground that you don't look disabled. And your percentage will anyway come out to be less than 40. So what's the purpose of getting a certification at all? That's what he has been told. Now, nowhere is it given in the act that you should only conduct an assessment if the percentage is likely to be more than 40. Yes, reservation is only for those with more than 40. There are other benefits that are given even to those with less than 40% disability. For example, extra time in an exam, if that is what their disability requires, or the ability to write with a scribe. And this the Supreme Court has also recognized. So, therefore, this requirement that only if the disability percentage is likely to be high should the hospital even take the trouble of conducting an assessment is quite a flawed way to look at it. So I think these two or three things I would definitely suggest having more subject matter experts who can evaluate that disability, having a greater focus on invisible disabilities and on functional limitations, I think are some improvements in the current system which should be made.
Getting into the Puja Khedkar case specifically, following this whole allegations of, her misuse of the disability quota, some top-ranking officials have asked for reviews of the reservation and even asked if it's necessary at all. Do you think the disability quota is being seen as a soft target that can easily be attacked?
Unfortunately, it is, and in particular, I must place on record my profound disquiet at the statements which Smita Sabharwal, who I believe is an IAS officer, made when she took to Twitter to say things like, you can't be a surgeon if you are a person with a disability, you can't work on the field if you are a person with a disability. So, quite apart from misuse, these people can't anyway perform the responsibilities of a civil servant. So, why have reservation for them at all? I think that is an extremely misguided and misplaced line of thinking, and is in fact contrary to the act itself also. In fact, I am a believer that even with respect to services like the IPS, persons with disabilities should be accommodated in them. You may not necessarily give them combat duties, you can give them non combat duties, in terms of giving them civil responsibilities, cyber crime related work, computer related activities which they can do without having to be on the field. But their brain power, memory, etc., those skills should definitely be utilized even in services which actually have a more field oriented approach. Even countries, right from the UK to Sierra Leone, even for the IPS, I am saying, you can imagine that they have also accommodated people with disabilities. So the argument to do so in other services like the IAS, IRS is even greater. And there have been people who have broken the glass ceiling. Ira Singhal's case, everyone knows about. where she secured rank 1 in the civil services in the general category, mind you. So, not even talking about reservation here, but is actually, has emerged as a role model for many. Then there was Beno Zafreen Beno, who is a blind officer in the Indian Foreign Service. There is the case of Shweta Bansal, who has a locomotor disability, who also had to get relief from the Delhi High Court before being appointed to the IAS. So there have been many cases where people have managed to discharge their responsibilities effectively. So that is so far as the competence side of things is concerned. The second part is of misuse. Now, nobody is saying that any kind of misuse should be condoned. And I've written an op-ed for the Hindu itself, where I say that me and my co-author, we say that this should be met with the strictest possible punishment, not just for the person concerned, but also for those who have actually certified them falsely. But just because of some bad apples, the entire system of reservation being overthrown would be like throwing the baby with the bathwater and you really using a hammer to destroy a nail, as they say. So I think it would be a totally disproportionate way of looking at it, and it's very unfortunate that some people have suggested this.
Talk to us a little bit about what you said a little earlier. Why are there still barriers at the level of you have written your exam, you have passed your interview, you have cleared the medical test that the UPSC sets for you? Why are there then still barriers when it comes to being given a posting?
Right. So I think so. There are a few issues here. One, for some disabilities, the UPSC has simply or the identification exercise that took place in 2021 for identification of posts, no disabilities were found suitable for certain categories of posts. For example, intellectual disabilities like autism, specific learning disabilities, etc. For them, even though the RPWD Act provides for reservation, no posts have been identified as being suitable for these disability types in this identification exercise that has been undertaken by the government, and which therefore means that somebody who has dyslexia, for example, today cannot become a civil servant in any of the 26 services that are recognized for which the civil services exams happen. That is one issue. The second is that there is often a resistance by the DOPT, unfortunately, to actually accommodate persons with disabilities, which results in a lot of litigation. And sometimes they do adopt an adversarial approach in these kinds of matters, where if somebody has managed to make the cut, there's no reason why they cannot actually perform. If they manage to clear the exam, they should be given a suitable posting. But they impose some on the other restriction, like this case of Karthik Kansal, which I read about 2 3 days ago, being reported in the media, where he has cleared the civil service examination 4 times. He has muscular dystrophy, and he's not been given any posting at all, on the ground that no post has been identified as being suitable for someone in his position. So this post identification exercise, according to me, is actually quite problematic, in the sense that we should not have a system. I mean, it's very simple, right? Do we have to think of, like, if we talk about gender equality or caste equality, right? Where do we say that when we are reserving posts for women or for scheduled caste persons, you first identify what posts are capable of being occupied by them and only confine the benefit of reservation to that? I mean, why have this exercise at all? I understand that in case of disability, there is a physical aspect to it, so some posts, physical or mental, so some posts cannot be occupied by persons with some disabilities. For example, somebody with blindness cannot become a bus driver, or somebody who has a hearing impairment may not be able to perform, the duties of conducting petrol operations, where you need to be very sensitive to whatever auditory inputs come in. So you can definitely blacklist some posts, have a negative list of posts for a particular disability which nobody can perform as of today, given the current state of technology. But having this requirement of identifying posts for each disability type is, I think, misplaced. So that is one reason why this happens, because when you are filling your form, at that time you are not applying for a particular post. At the highest, you may indicate a preferred service. But when that has to be matched, your rank, etc., with the post to be given to you, it is there that limitations arise.
Last question before we wrap up shortly, sir. How well is the reasonable accommodation principle in the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act being implemented in the government and in the private sector? It's been some years now since this act came in, so what is your view on this?
Right. So there has definitely been undeniable progress in terms of ensuring better infrastructure, assistive technology, access to assistive technology. I think the Act requires every establishment to have an equal opportunity policy. The term establishment includes private and public establishments, private and government establishments, that's the term which it uses. And merely by dint of the statutory mandate, some amount of compliance has happened in terms of establishments making sure that they have such a policy in place. Has it happened at the pace we would have liked, at the scale we would have liked? No. I think that is because disability compliances are still seen as sort of a nice to have rather than a must have for establishments. Those that don't have these policies or do not provide reasonable accommodation aren't made to face the music strongly enough by disability commissions or by courts. And unfortunately, companies do conduct this evaluation of figuring out what is the maximum penalty they may have to face if they were not to comply. So, if they feel that that is not too high, they might just take the risk. So, therefore, I think the statutory watchdog that we have, the disability commissions, need to act with boldness and sort of forthrightness in terms of utilizing all the powers that they have to exact greater compliance. I think with respect to the private sector, it's very subjective and ad hoc. So I can't give a general answer which applies to establishments across the board. Except to say that some establishments still feel that having to provide reasonable accommodations will put them at a competitive disadvantage. That they are not doing this for anybody else. So why should they do it for a disabled person? Because tomorrow everybody will then ask for the same benefits. So they don't recognize that substantive equality requires that you provide that affirmative action measure or that positive support measure for a person with a disability which you would not provide for someone without a disability. So I think that recognition still has to seep in within our societal consciousness.
Let's just end by circling back to the case that we were talking about. So, you would say that, as you pointed out, plugging the loopholes when it comes to people who are falsely certifying those without disabilities as having disabilities, as well as, say, making some changes to the whole certification and this rank, and the UPSC's decision to categorize posts. You would say those are like the need of the hour.
Yes, so I think definitely we need to make sure that any instances of misuse that come to light are dealt with strictly, while also ensuring that persons who genuinely have a disability aren't made to suffer because of this. I think that is critical. And making sure that, I mean, if number one, we should reconsider whether we want to have this identification business at all of posts. To my mind, we shouldn't. But that again is something which the act itself requires. So if that's what we then have to live with, then within that, at least making sure that we do not have these arbitrary exclusions due to which someone like a Karthik Kansal doesn't get a posting for 4 consecutive cycles of having cleared the exam in the reservation quota, or because of which people with dyslexia are completely excluded from the ambit of reservation so far as the civil services are concerned. I think those two things are extremely critical. And the third one is when people make these statements, right, that, how will someone with a disability be able to do this or do that? strict action should be taken against them. I mean, Rule 7 of the All India Services Rules says that civil servants cannot criticize the existing policies of the government that exist publicly. Now, whatever you may think about that in the context of a democracy, the fact of the matter is that there is a provision for reservation under Section 34 of the Act, and it's not like the civil services are exempt from that. So, as of now, that is the law of the land. So quite apart from the insensitivity of it, it's also contrary to how these persons are supposed to behave in terms of the All India Service Rules, which binds all civil servants.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, Mr. Bajaj.
Pleasure.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.